Good evening, Strong Stance listeners. I'm your host, Eli Strong. And friends, I have to tell you that I am tired. I'm more than tired. I'm exhausted. Over the last several weeks, these bathroom bills have been consuming. And it's not just the bills, it's the conversations that inevitably come with them. For those that don't know, or just a refresher for those that do, in the last several weeks, both the state of North Carolina and the city of Oxford, Alabama, have passed legislation limiting or prohibiting the trans community from utilizing the public facilities of their correct gender. For several weeks, I posted little other than news. And then after unfriending a number of people because the vitriol and hate I was seeing was just too much for me to mentally stomach any longer, I started voicing why some of these bills make no sense and the increased risk they pose to the trans community. Voicing those points brought out more conversations, both civil, educated conversations, as well as hateful, ignorant ones. And I'm tired. And these aren't laws on the other side of the world or across the country that don't affect me. These are laws that are in places I regularly find myself in. Most of you know that while I currently live in Georgia, I'm originally from Alabama. Most of my family lives outside Birmingham, which has me driving through Oxford, Alabama anytime I go visit. Most of you may also know that my day job is based in Washington, D.C., and every time that I fly into the main office, I have a layover in Charlotte, North Carolina. My wife's family all live in North Carolina. We're looking for a farm in North Carolina. So it leaves me in this place of feeling like these are both homes and away to me and feeling extremely personal about what's happening. So I'm doing something I've never done before on this podcast. There will be no guests tonight. Just me. I just want to talk about this issue. I need to process it. And right now, this is the best way I know how. To just lay out what's on my mind at the moment and how I feel about it. So before I start talking about the back and forth of all the different positions, let's talk about the two laws that have gotten the most press. The first is North Carolina's HB 2. Now, there's a ton that can be talked about with regard to HB 2, from what it covers, what it doesn't cover, what it forbids or allows, to the disgraceful way in which it was passed. But right now, I just want to talk about the quote-unquote bathroom or public facilities portion of the law. As of March 23rd, 2016, anyone using a public facility in the state of North Carolina must use the facility that matches their, quote, biological sex. Now, first, I want to clear something up, and this is something that seems to be misreported a lot with regard to this bill. Well, with both bills, in fact. The law states that biological sex is defined as the sex designated on that person's birth certificate, not what sex they were originally assigned at birth. Now, that's a pretty important distinction because for some folks that is one and the same, and for some folks it's not. The reason I want to bring that up is that I've heard a lot of discussion within the trans community about, different memes have popped up on Facebook about you're asking for this person to use the women's restroom or you're asking for this person to use the men's restroom when the photos show someone who most cis people would never assume to be trans, basically meaning that they are read as their correct gender, or the term that, I kind of hate is that they quote-unquote pass. But there is some passing privilege that goes into these laws, and I will talk about that. But the other reason why I want to bring this up is that for the well-meaning trans folks that do want to protest this law in either of these areas by going into the bathroom that the law says that they have to, and basically showing, see, this is what you're asking for. You're asking for a woman to go into the men's room because you won't allow her to use the correct restroom, or you're asking for someone who you think looks like every other guy that you know going into the women's room. It's important to remember what this law says and what it doesn't, because if you have had your birth certificate changed and legally even with this law, you should be using the bathroom of your correct gender, you can also get into some hot water there. Now, of course, that's just a warning. I encourage people to protest in whatever means that they find necessary, hopefully peacefully, but and if getting arrested for something like this is something that you want to do, I am definitely not telling you not to. I'm just trying to state that this is something that a lot of people have kind of glossed over or not really explained, that this does have to do, that both areas are defining quote-unquote biological sex as what is stated on your birth certificate. Okay. The other thing about this law is that the state of North Carolina has basically said that this is what has to happen in public facilities that are government run, but really leaves each business to adopt their own or make their own policy. And so after all was said and done, a number of businesses, most publicly Target, stated that trans people could use whichever restroom they most identified with rather than what was marked on their birth certificate. Okay? Now, in response to that decision by Target, which they said applied to all Target customers and employees in all locations, the city of Oxford, Alabama, on April 26, 2016, passed City Ordinance 2016-18 that also states that people using public restrooms and changing facilities must use the facility that matches their biological sex, quote unquote. Like North Carolina, the law defines that biological sex as what's designated on one's birth certificate. But here's the two main difference between North Carolina's law and Oxford's law. First, while HB 2 in North Carolina doesn't specifically address the penalty for violating this law, Oxford's ordinance places the penalty at a $500 fine and up to 6 months in jail, which is absolutely ridiculous. Second, while North Carolina's law allows private businesses like Target to set their own policy, Oxford's law states that all businesses must follow this new ordinance that they've passed and cannot set their own policy. So the Target in Oxford, and yes, there is one, can't refuse to follow the law. Can they turn a blind eye? Sure. But if a Target customer is uncomfortable with another customer's presence in the restroom and calls the police, which, by the way, is what the police department is requesting that they do, it's what the government requests that they do, is report people, report suspects who they think are breaking this law, that if they call the police, the law is still in place and that person can be arrested regardless of Target's corporate policy. Okay, and these two differences have led a number of people to consider Oxford's law the strictest in the nation. So let's talk brass tacks. Like most of the harmful side effects of being trans in a transphobic society, these laws disproportionately affect trans women, particularly those who are not read as women by the general public, and gender nonconforming people. Trans men are also affected, but society doesn't seem as threatened by trans men, and that has been blatantly obvious in the quote-unquote concerns that the public has voiced. All of those concerns paint the target as deviant men in dresses trying to harm women and children. But that doesn't change the fear that a majority of trans people feel when using a public facility, a restroom, or a locker room or changing room in some public facility, as the law states, where a person would be partially or completely in a state of undress. And that's particularly in an area with one of these bills, right? So, I started testosterone about a little less than 8 years ago. And so I have been read as male for the most part for quite a while. But it doesn't really change the fact that every time I walk into a public bathroom, there's a moment of fear and a moment of hesitation right before I walk into a men's room. And that fear is heightened when I walk in to find another person in there. And that is regardless of where that is. That doesn't matter if I'm in San Francisco or in Birmingham or in Georgia or whatever the case may be. Honestly, the only time that doesn't happen is if I'm in someone's house. And, quite frankly, even in someone's house, if I don't know them that well, I'm praying that the lock on that door works. I cannot tell you the number of times that I've gone to a public bathroom or even a private bathroom, closed the door, locked it, and then tested the lock myself to see, can somebody bust in here? Because that is the level of just normal fear that I tend to live with. There's a lot of bars in the places that I've been that have bathrooms, single stall or otherwise, where the lock just quite frankly doesn't work if there is a lock to begin with. I've been walked in on installs several times. Like that's a normal thing, and most cisgender men and maybe most cisgender women wouldn't think twice about that. Oh, how embarrassing is maybe the only thing that they would think of. But for me, I brief other friends. If I've just gone into a bathroom and I'm with a group of trans friends, and particularly if they're going to be using the men's restroom, I might tell them, hey, listen, there's no lock on the door, but the width of the bathroom is slim enough to where you can wedge your foot up against it and nobody can walk in. That's the level of fear, even after 8 years, and the level of prep work that my brain goes through just to go to the bathroom. Okay? And that's before all of these laws happen. So now use that, compound that with walking into a bathroom in a place where, Oxford, I never lived in Oxford, but it is quite frequent that when I go back and forth to Birmingham, that is one of the places where my wife and I will stop to have dinner or stop to do a little shopping. I think there's a bookstore there that we've stopped a couple times at to pick up some magazines or some adult coloring books and, whatever the case may be. And as I mentioned, North Carolina, I'm there all the time. And so when these laws are passed, they're not targeting me, but and they're not targeting a good chunk of the rest of the trans community, particularly trans men or people who, are read as their correct gender, but we're collateral damage. It still affects our mental and emotional and therefore by extension, our physical health, particularly if we do what a good chunk of trans people do, which is hold it, which is never a comfortable or healthy thing to do. So, but I do want to make it clear that I'm not the person that these laws are targeting. So if I'm not the person that they're targeting and I'm still feeling this kind of feeling about it, I cannot imagine what it is like to walk into a women's restroom as a trans woman, particularly a trans woman of color, at that intersection, of lack of privilege, especially, regardless of whether a birth certificate has been changed, right? But I do want to make that very clear that I'm going to talk about a number of things that I feel about here, but I do recognize that I'm not the main target of these laws. Like most things in our transphobic society, it is not me that they are targeting. It is very often trans women and gender nonconforming people. So I want to talk about some of the statements that people have made as their argument for why these laws are necessary. And when I refer to these laws, I'm going to try to keep it such that these laws that I'm talking about are the HB2 in North Carolina and 2016-18 in Oxford or other bathroom laws like it. I am not talking about laws that grant, the laws like there are in D.C. that grant full equality, okay? But some of the things that people have come to me and said as far as this is why they're concerned or this is why they think that they'd be a good idea, I want to talk about those. I want to give them real space because I want to break them down and talk about the reasons why I quite honestly think that while I get why you might think that, it's not a legitimate fear and it is quite frankly not... it's not founded. And so just kind of in the points that are made, the counterpoints that there are, that kind of thing, where the point is this is why this law is good, and the counterpoints are really breaking this down into, no, this is this is not